The Sibling Society by Robert Bly. Abridged, read by Vincent Bagnall. Introduction. It's the worst of times. It's the best of times. That's how we feel as we navigate from a paternal society now discredited to a society in which impulse is given its way. People don't bother to grow up. We are all fish swimming in a tank of half-adults. The rule is, where repression was before, fantasy will now be. We human beings limp along, running after our own fantasy. We can never catch up, and so we defeat ourselves by the simplest possible means: speed. Everywhere we go, there's a crowd, and the people all look alike. We begin to live a lateral life, catch glimpses out of the corners of our eyes, keep the TV set at eye level, watch the scores move horizontally across the screen. We see what's coming out of the side view mirror. It seems like intimacy. Maybe not intimacy as much as proximity. Maybe not proximity as much as sameness. Americans who are 20 years old see others who look like them in Czechoslovakia, Greece, China, France, Brazil, Germany, and Russia wearing the same jeans, listening to the same music, speaking a universal language that computer literacy demands. Sometimes they feel more vitally connected to siblings elsewhere than to family members in the next room. We see the millions like ourselves all over the world. Our eyes meet uniformity, resemblance, likeness, rather than distinction and differences. Hope rises immediately for the long-desired possibility of community, and yet it would be foolish to overlook the serious implications of this glance to the side, this tilt of the head. Mass society, with its demand for work without responsibility, creates a gigantic army of rival siblings, in Alexander Mitscherlich's words. This book is not about siblings in a family. We'll use the word sibling as a metaphor. We'll try to make the phrase sibling society into a lens, bringing into focus certain tendencies, habits, and griefs we have all noticed. Adults regress toward adolescence, and adolescents, seeing that, have no desire to become adults. Few are able to imagine any genuine life coming from the vertical plane: tradition, religion, devotion. Even graduate students in science are said to share this problem. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky writes, "My students usually come with ego boundaries, like exoskeletons. Most have no use for religion, precedents, or tradition. They want their rituals newly minted and shared horizontally within their age group, not vertically over time. The ones I train to become scientists go at it like warriors, overturning reigning paradigms, each discovery a murder of their scientific ancestors. Perhaps 1/3 of our society has developed these new sibling qualities. The rest of us are walking in that direction. When we all arrive, there may be no public schools at all, nor past paradigms, because only people one's own age will be worth listening to. There is little in the sibling society to prevent a slide into primitivism and into those regressions that fascism is so fond of." Eric Hoffer remarked, "Drastic change has produced this social primitivism. A new identity is found by embracing a mass movement. The mass movement absorbs and assimilates the individual, who is thereby reduced to an infantile state, for this is what a new birth really means, to become like a child. And children are primitive beings. They are credulous, follow a leader, and readily become members of a pack. Finally, primitivism also follows when people seek a new identity by plunging into ceaseless action and hustling. It takes leisure to mature. People in a hurry can neither grow nor decay. They are preserved in a state of perpetual puerility. The society of half-adults, built on technology and affluence, is more highly developed here than in any other country on earth. But in other parts of the globe, the same tendencies are growing fast. We can't be definitive, but we can glance at some of its characteristics. It is hard in a sibling society to decide what is real. We participate in more and more non-events. A non-event transpires when the organizer promises an important psychic or political event and then cheats people, providing material only tangentially related. An odd characteristic of the sibling society is that no one effectively objects. Some sort of trance takes over if enough people are watching an event simultaneously. It is a contemporary primitivism, participation mystique, a mysterious participation of all the clan. Kierkegaard once, in trying to predict what the future society would be like, offered this metaphor. People will put up a poster soon saying, "Tonight John Eric will skate on thin ice at the very center of the pond. It'll be very dangerous. Please come." Everyone comes, and John Eric skates about 3 inches from shore. And people say, "Look, he's skating on thin ice at the very center of the pond." A lecturer says, "On Friday night, we will have a revolution." When Friday night comes, the hall is filled, and the radical talks passionately and flamboyantly for an hour and a half. Then he declares that a revolution took place here tonight. The audience pours out into the street saying, "Tonight we had a revolution! Tonight we had a revolution!" Non-events are now a regular national feature. Millions watch them. Tiny Tim being married on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. CNN reporting the Grenada invasion. Elaborate celebrity efforts such as We Are the World. In a recent non-event, Diane Sawyer interviewed Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley, implying a promise to confront the dark secrets of Jackson's past, and a promise that she herself would be an adult in her concern for the truth. She was not an adult that night, and the hidden event was a marriage of Sony and ABC. It's hard for journalists or ordinary people to get away from envy when they look at a leader. Every detail of a president's life is used to discredit him. President Clinton has his faults, but no other American president has been put in the stocks so soon and left there so long. Recent biographies of Franklin Roosevelt mention how careful journalists at that time were not to photograph him when he was moved from his car to a wheelchair. It wasn't an attempt to hide failings, but to give him some place of dignity in his leadership. The American Spectator carries ads offering pins that say, "It's a bird, it's a plane, it's Hillary, nix the witch in 96. Or a bumper sticker for a $3 reading, "Newt's mom was right." Journalists and ordinary citizens join together in this mixture of envy and aggression. Adam Gopnik, in his piece on recent journalism, remarks, "In the past 20 years, the American press has undergone a transformation from an access culture to an aggression culture. Aggression has become a kind of abstract form practiced in a void of ideas, or even of ordinary sympathy. One sad result of this habit of envy and aggression is the utter discouragement and bitterness of voters who move into an adolescent place in relation to the duties of citizenship. It is hard to be as popular as we are supposed to be. The super ego, or interior judge, has altered its requirements. An interior judge that once demanded high standards in art, in writing, and in ethics now requires early success at 20 or 22. Those instances on early success have devastated the art world. The French writer Gilles Lipovetsky says, "The superego presents itself under the guise of demands for fame and success which, if they're not achieved, unleash an implacable storm of criticism against the ego. The interior judge remains authoritarian and brutal, but it no longer asks the citizen to be honorable, disciplined, and noble. Now it wants its owner to have public gratification. We could say the superego wants everyone to appear on talk shows. The very act that it would have forbidden as vulgar 100 years ago. The interior judge's changed requirements paradoxically give the media much more power than they have ever had before, and the media's accidental conferring of fame can become highly dangerous to the unwary. Most adults have been slow to grasp how perfectionist the changed interior judge of their children is, and how savage. The judge is more perfectionist than ever, but now there's not enough fame or popularity in the world to satisfy it. For parents to try to encourage the development of their children is natural, but now there's something desperate in it for both parents and children. If a teenager is not invited to the dance, she may try suicide. A high school boy scoffed at may retreat behind his computer for 10 years. That is how the picture looks among the advantaged. In the other half of society, we see the absolute despair of young black men who don't need an interior judge to tell them they have no chance of finding a good-paying job or any job. They have the longing and the wanting and no legal possibility of satisfying it. As we all know, 1 out of 3 young black men are in the criminal justice system in some form. Their despair is beginning to resonate through the entire culture. That is why suburban children want rap music. In the past, an authoritarian judge demanded obedience to parents, insisted on sexual purity, and one could say advocated high morals. The interior judge no longer uses Jesus or Gandhi to keep its bearings, but must shift instead to Barbra Streisand or Michael Jackson or a television anchor. For the one who fails to become successful and well-loved, punishment is swift and thorough. Self-esteem receives a battering from inside. Everyone feels insignificant and unseen until, in desperation, we finally agree to go on a talk show and tell it all. Once that moment is over, and universal love has not poured over our heads following the program, we fall still farther. Sadly, longing for perfection in ourselves is, in the phrase of one observer, perfectly compatible with indifference toward others. Why has the interior judge become so brutal and terroristic? We can say that advertising from a child's earliest years has so influenced the greedy, desirous part of the child's soul that the resisting force, the judge, has to enlarge itself in order to combat the inflamed wanting. The interior judge, moreover, can no longer rely on outward authority in its battle against impulse. Having to resist without help from the parents or teachers, it has to do it all alone, and so it naturally moves toward a primitive, humorless savagery, well expressed in grunge rock, action movies, and piercing of body parts. The idea that our interior judge has changed its demands from requiring us to be good to requiring us to be famous is very sobering. If the super ego, detached from verticality and stretched out across the horizontal plane, truly has changed, it means that consumer capitalism's dependence on stimulating greed and desirousness has changed something fundamental inside the human being, a result that Freud never anticipated. In a sibling society, it's hard to know how to approach one's children, what values to try to teach them, what to stand up for, what to go along with. It is especially hard to know where your children are. Chapter 1. The Woodstock Moment. Michael Ventura has said that at some point in 1956, when Elvis Presley let his pelvis move to the music on the Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey show, all the parents in the United States lost their children in a single night. The first Woodstock 13 years later signaled a change in American culture. Some unjust severity had been overcome or bypassed. Fundamentalist harshness, Marxist rigidity, the stiff ethic of high school superintendents had passed away. People greeted each other, clothed or naked, in delight, feeling that a victory of humanness had taken place. With the help of rock music, young men and women felt freed from a parental or institutional tyrant, the one with a thin nose, a black coat, and steel-rimmed glasses, the one who had told them in grade school to sit down, to behave, to repress sexual impulses, to hold their bodies stiffly, to salute the flag and stand up when a teacher enters the room. The popular heroes of the late 1950s, James Dean, Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, and Jack Kerouac, all took part in that struggle to loosen everyone up, and were loved for it by the older brothers and sisters of the Woodstock young. At Woodstock, the high school students won. What had they won? A battle against what Jules Henry in 1962 called the Indo-European Islamic Hebraic impulse control system. That's a mouthful, but it says it well. All of us who lived in the 1950s saw so many lives destroyed by repression, by fear, by internalized superintendents, by shaming, by workaholism. By 1969, it felt as if human beings were able, for the first time in history, to choose their own roads, choose what to do with their own bodies, choose the visionary possibilities formerly shut off by that control system. Elvis was a part of what women had longed for, not militaristic, not rigid in feeling, not exclusionary toward mothers and young women, but lighthearted, open to impulses rising from below his belt, playful and yet grounded in sexuality, heavier than Peter Pan, more human than stiff-faced old grandfather who wound clocks. Young women felt themselves losing some of their Doris Day rigidity, their shame over their own sexual impulses. Why shouldn't a young woman make love with a man she found attractive? Any man. Why shouldn't she encourage pornography to help loosen up the males? Why shouldn't she give up her mother's stuff about wasting until the ring is on the hand before having fun with zippers? Schools had taught for centuries the Indo-European Islamic Hebraic impulse control system. The impulse control system smelled of limitation. Schools stank of it. The Indo-European Islamic Hebraic impulse control system reeked of the bald, the severe, the cabined, the icebound, the squat, the cramped, the dinky, the narrow, the scanty, the roped in, the meager, the bad, the tame. Woodstock, on the other hand, smelled of the grandiose, the footloose, the grandiloquent, the lofty, the radical, the bountiful, the prodigal, the free-spirited, the free-speaking, the free-tongued, the unconditional, the escaped, the unbuttoned, the cut-loose, the exonerated, the unreined, the good, the princely, the escaped. In 1962, Jules Henry interviewed a number of high school students for his book, Culture Against Man. Repeatedly, he heard them say that they liked whichever parent let them do what they wanted. What the children talk about most is whether the parent lets me or doesn't let me. What permits impulse release is good, and anything that blocks it is bad. What is cause and what is effect is hard to know, but some fathers and some mothers gave up their strictness in the late 1950s and early 1960s. One could say that teachers and parents, and certainly the popular media, gave up defending the Indo-European Islamic Hebraic impulse control system, which subscribed to a certain asceticism for the young, postponement of pleasure, hard work, no fooling around. When the Englishman Geoffrey Gorer visited the United States, he noticed the extraordinary desire of American grown-ups to be loved. They didn't seem to feel it necessary to love in return. Rather, to be the object of love was all that was required. How could one be more clearly worthy of love than to agree to whatever your children want? The movie Mrs. Doubtfire provides a clear example of this. As it begins, the father, played by Robin Williams, is already so far advanced along the permissive route that his let's-all-be-funny party actually precipitates divorce. The reluctant wife is then left to stand alone for super ego values. The scriptwriters make her a lawyer. Why would fathers, in particular, suddenly want love so much from their children? Jules Henry guessed that the American workplace had become more cold and barren than it was in the 19th century. A man received little fellow feeling there and needed more of it at home. Those years saw the unmasking of a masculine hunger for emotional gratification. Deprived in his work life of personality aspirations, the American father reaches deeply into the emotional resources of his family for gratifications formerly considered womanly. The tenderness and closeness of his children, and his children reach thirstily toward him. Perhaps the fathers didn't feel enough loving support from the village, now transmuted into the suburb. Or perhaps they missed love from their grandparents, or had become conscious of how little love their remote fathers gave them. For whatever reason, many fathers in the late 1950s gave up their traditional setting of limits, and in return asked for new sorts of love from their children at a price. The children soon saw they had been put into power. As divorce became more common and custody remained with the mothers, the children's power increased. The father began being permissive when the children visited on weekends, formerly a time when children would be required to take on tasks as members of a family. But if the father isn't in the house, obviously he can't require the children to do homework or any of the tasks they find onerous. By 1980, most high schools were being run by their own students, and that has not changed. School teachers all over the country will testify to that. If teachers ask for more homework, the students refuse, and the school board, mostly parents, usually sides with the students. Contemporary school teachers tell hundreds of such stories. One story that a teacher of advanced algebra told will stand for many. This teacher realized that one of his students had stopped attending class. He called the parents. "I thought you ought to know that your son has dropped out of advanced algebra." He had made many such calls over the years and expected to hear as he would have in the past. "What did you say?" "He hasn't said a word about that to me. I'll talk to him. If he began the class, he'll have to finish it." But now, the reply is different. In 9 out of 10 calls, the parent, father or mother, says, without anger or urgency, something like, "We've brought him or her up to make up his own mind and make his own decisions. So I think we have to respect that." That's the end of the algebra class. If a student acts up and the behavioral problem is brought to the attention of the parent or parents, they usually want the student to be turned over to the school psychologist. The psychologist will have to do the tough work of listening, establishing requirements, and so on. All over the country, the old structures of the impulse control system have loosened. The superego took its hands away from the throats of young people, or so it seemed, and the whole nation relaxed, felt less depression, endured less repression. The Beatles said something, happily, about living in a yellow submarine. Yet something went wrong. How did we move from the optimistic, companionable, food-passing youngsters gathered on that field at Woodstock to the self-doubting, dark-hearted, turned-in, death-praising, indifferent, wised-up, deconstructionist audience that now attends a grunge music concert? That is the question we need to answer. Chapter 2, Jack, the Beanstalk, and the Giant with a Large Appetite. In the days of King Alfred, there lived a poor woman, whose cottage was situated in a remote country village, a great many miles from London. She had been a widow some years, and had an only child named Jack, whom she indulged to a fault. The consequence of her blind partiality was that Jack did not pay the least attention to anything she said, but was indolent, careless, and extravagant. His follies were not owing to a bad disposition, but that his mother had never checked him. By degrees she disposed of all she possessed. Scarcely anything remained but a cow. The poor woman one day met Jack with tears in her eyes. Her distress was great, and for the first time in her life she could not help reproaching him, saying, "Indeed, dear son, you have at last brought me to beggary and ruin. I have not money enough to purchase food for another day. Nothing remains for me but to sell my cow. I'm very sorry to part with her. It grieves me sadly, but we must not starve." For 5 minutes Jack felt a degree of remorse, but it was soon over, and he importuned his mother to let him sell the cow at the next village. As he was going along, he met a butcher, who inquired why he was driving the cow from home. Jack replied it was his intention to sell it. There were various colors, and attracted Jack's notice. This did not pass unnoticed by the butcher, who, knowing Jack's easy temper, thought now was the time to take advantage of it, and determined not to let slip so good an opportunity, asked what was the price of the cow, offering at the same time all the beans in his hat for her. The silly boy could not express his pleasure at what he supposed so great an offer. The bargain was struck instantly, and the cow exchanged for a few paltry beans. Jack made the best of his way home, calling aloud to his mother before he reached the house, thinking to surprise her. When she saw the beans and heard Jack's account, her patience quite forsook her. She kicked the beans away in a passion. They flew in all directions. Some were scattered into the garden. The poor woman reflected on her great loss and was quite in despair. Not having anything to eat, they both went supperless to bed. Jack awoke very early in the morning, and seeing something uncommon from the window of his bedchamber, ran downstairs into the garden, where he soon discovered that some of the beans had taken root and sprung up surprisingly. The stalks were of an immense thickness, and had so entwined that they formed a ladder, nearly like a chain in appearance. Looking upwards, he could not discern the top. It appeared to be lost in the clouds. He tried it, found it firm, and not to be shaken. He quickly formed the resolution of endeavoring to climb up to the top, in order to seek his fortune, and ran to communicate his intention to his mother, not doubting that she would be equally pleased with himself. She declared he should not go, and said he would break her heart. Entreated and threatened, but all in vain. Jack set out, and after climbing for some hours, reached the top of the beanstalk, fatigued and quite exhausted. Looking around, he found himself in a strange country. It appeared to be a desert, quite barren, not a tree, shrub, house, or living creature to be seen. Here and there were scattered fragments of unhewn stone, and at unequal distances small heaps of earth were loosely thrown together. Jack seated himself pensively upon a block of stone, and thought of his mother, and reflected with sorrow on his disobedience in climbing the beanstalk against her inclination. He concluded that he must now die with hunger. This tale sounds like the story of a contemporary mother with her teenage son who is indolent, careless, and extravagant, with no fatherly limitation on him. But it also has a third element, the overwhelming energy of the giant, whose headlong greed eventually dominates the lives of both mother and son. And something in this pattern of energies, a parent, a child, and a third presence in the house, that seems barbarous, is familiar. The physical landscape of the giant's territory suggests regression to a barbarous state, a time before sculpture or cities. It appeared to be a desert, quite barren, not a tree, shrub, house, or living creature to be seen. Here and there were scattered fragments of unhewn stone, and at unequal distances small heaps of earth were loosely thrown together. It's clear that we are now in the other world, the place where all time is present time, where all historical periods exist together, and certain actions take place over and over. The giant, whom the boy is about to meet, will be a serious enemy. Sociologists, who ordinarily inhabit only the physical world, will probably bail out of the story at this point. Marxists will insist that the giant is the patriarchy, or perhaps he represents all landlords. I enjoy saying that too, but it isn't quite appropriate here. We need to catch a glimpse of something the Marxists, for all their attentiveness, do not see. From the point of view of contemporary culture, we can speculate about why we have moved in only 30 years, from the gladness of the free Woodstock to the terrorized schools full of guns. Jack and the Beanstalk is one of those prophetic stories that appear, God knows from where, perhaps from residual memory of cultures in the past that have also suffered a falling back like ours. Unknown to Jack at the start, there has always been some large and cruel being in his story, behind the scenes, although very much involved in everything that has happened. We can say that during the Woodstock period, a large and cruel being lurked just out of sight, and those listening to Crosby, Stills, and Nash did not see him. Perhaps the obvious brutality of the Vietnam War occupied all our attention. We saw brutality every day on television, and it distracted us from the invisible being nearby. The savage acts taking place overseas with their napalm and Christmas bombings were so engrossing that people's attention to dark things nearby faded. Little energy was left to see beings close to us who were part shadow and part God. We recall how the invisible beings in the Iliad are both seen and unseen. They float down from mountain peaks and secretly aid either the Trojans or the Achaeans. Goya's canvas, The Giant, offers an image of a god such as this. The bottom of the canvas shows refugees huddled in caravans like displaced or fleeing gypsies. There's a sense of suffering, hastily cooked meals, chaos, and poverty. Rising high above these preoccupied miniature people is an enormous being, 200 or 300 feet tall, a giant that none of the human beings seem to notice. The painting hints at the human inability to see it even when it is close. Who was this one who was just out of sight at Woodstock, and who later appeared at Altamont and Oklahoma City? The crone knows the whole story. She remembers that the giant stabbed the benevolent parent inside his own study. We can say that the father was the giant's first obstacle to his reclaiming of territory. The library is important because books bring information about the giant, so he likes to burn those down. When the father was dead, he set the house on fire. Having gained your father's confidence, he knew where to find all his treasure. He soon loaded himself and his wife, set the house on fire in several places, and when the servants returned, the house was burnt down to the ground. The presence of the giant in the house, our psychic house, is connected with some other house being burned to the ground. Giants and witches populate many stories. Some giants are stupid but charming. And those types, easily bamboozled because they are so tall, so far from the ground, can easily be deceived and manipulated by Tom Thumbs. In the Grimm brothers' story, The Raven, we meet three giant brothers who are important for the traveler because they have maps somewhere in the house that show how to get to the golden castle of Stromberg. The giants haven't been asked about the maps for a long time. There's something archaic about all giants, prehistoric, earlier than cities, perhaps even earlier than laid walls, a detail our story hints at with the mention of the unhewn stones. The giant who deals with Jack is not one of the charming ones. He eats people. Our story takes place on two separate planes. The human plane, on which Jack and his mother live in their cabin surrounded by some sort of village, and another more ominous place at the top of the Beanstalk, where a giant and his wife live surrounded by stones and barren fields. There's some suggestion that this giant lives in the brain on top of the Beanstalk, since the head balances itself on the spinal cord, but it's only a suggestion. The first rule for interpreting fairy stories, the same rule used in interpreting dreams, is that everyone in the story belongs inside one psyche. If in a dream, the dreamer's car hits a large stone on a rainy road, we can say that the car represents the dreamer, but the stone also represents the dreamer, and the road somehow represents the dreamer as well. If we do that with our story, the Beanstalk is inside us, the mother and the son are inside us, and the two planes are inside us. First interpretation. What is the giant? A long-standing philosophical habit in the West is to take the Enlightenment view of human nature, which says that human beings are good, and they only occasionally fall into evil behavior. That's the optimistic view. Some even in the West take the more somber view that emphasizes the aggressive animal base, the dark instinctive substructure, which is older than our ego, that dark ground that is implacably reborn with every child. According to that view, our human houses are built over a rough, selfish, pre-social animal ground. The substructure is powerful because it does not change. Any thought that the 2,000 years of Christianity and 500 years of the Enlightenment had softened its crude and brutal nature had to be abandoned when the first photographs of the camps at Sachsenhausen and Auschwitz appeared. The photographs were a huge shock for Europeans, hardly bearable. Some Americans perhaps did not feel it as deeply because we ended World War II proud of the skill and discipline that helped win it. We seemed to ourselves to be part of the Enlightenment, but the Europeans, and in a way the entire world, saw in the war the utter defeat of the Enlightenment. George Steiner, born in Geneva, said, "My own consciousness is possessed by the eruption of barbarism in modern Europe. This is the crisis of rational humane expectation, which has shaped my own life. It did not spring up on the Gobi Desert. It rose from within and from the core of European civilization. The cry of the murdered sounded in the earshot of the university. The sadism went on a street away from the theaters and museums." European civilization had not eradicated the understructure that the camps represented. The archaic brutality resembled a rough, thoughtless animal being, shrugging a small culture bird off its shoulder. We can take the giant to stand for our archaic, brutal underpinning. On our human plane, we live among sunlit windows with red geraniums on them. We live surrounded by cows and milk and kindness, by conversation and codes of politeness, by loving parents and cared-for children. But on the second and older plane, which is firmly ensconced at the top of the beanstalk, at the base of the skull, there are stones that have never been shaped, piles of dirt loosely thrown together, and most of all, appetites on a scale that is not human. There are immense hungers and gigantic angers and cages where people are kept to be eaten a little later. Children are especially favored as food there, and if a human being should wander into that instinctive plane, he or she had better be ready to hide. That is what Anne Frank did, and that is what we all do. Despite the controls that the Church Fathers laboriously laid out in their various councils to intensify the codes, and despite the various ideas of order that we make up in solitary rooms, we had better know, once we reach the top of the beanstalk, where the giant's cookie jar is. And we had better climb in. Then, from inside the cookie jar, we can sing a little Irene, good night. Our task in this chapter is to elaborate the picture of the giant so we can see what we are facing in everyday life, and then to ask why facing that power is more difficult if the child is fatherless or motherless. Brain researchers have established that each of us has a tripartite brain. Each brain is really three brains. Like old Roman buildings whose foundations remain, even though covered by later cities, the earliest brains were not absorbed as we evolved, but added on to. The most primitive brain lies at the base of the skull and is a part of the brain stem. This is the phylogenetically oldest part of the brain, its core, roughly corresponding to the basic structures of the reptile's brain. This brain, in human times, has become specialized for alarm, for response to fear, and for survival of the organism. Paul MacLean has said that the persistent trait of paranoia in us is probably caused by our inability to shut off the energy sources to the reptile brain. MacLean, whose research is fundamental for this field, calls it the archicortex, or the reptile brain, and says of it that when the psychiatrist bids the patient to lie on the couch, he's asking him to stretch out alongside a crocodile. The crocodile, if asked to express its troubles in words, cannot do so, and the inability is beyond the help of language training. When this brain is stimulated, it sets off alarms and prepares to face danger. The second oldest brain is called the mesocortex. MacLean calls it the old mammalian brain, the so-called limbic lobe of the cerebellum. Limbic means hemming in, and the term was coined in 1878 by the great brain mapper, Paul Broca. The limbic system, then, is made up of the two older brains, the reptilian and the primitive mammalian. The paleomammalian brain is an inheritance from the lower mammals. It can be compared to a rhinoceros or a horse. Investigations of the last 20 years have shown that the lower mammalian brain plays a fundamental role in emotional behavior and has a greater capacity than the reptilian brain for learning new approaches and solutions to problems on the basis of immediate experience. But like the reptilian brain, it does not have the ability to put its feelings into words. The primary distinction between reptile species and mammal species is the warm blood of the latter. The old mammal brain has some qualities we associate with warm blood: passion, intensity, jealousy, wildness, erotic obsession, greediness, ferocity, loyalty over years, anger, and artistic madness. In this discussion, we will call the oldest brain the survival brain, with its alarm system, and we will call the old mammal brain the feeding, sexuality, and the ferocity system. We make excuses for the old mammalian brain, and French courts provided lesser penalties at one time for crimes of passion. We know that a divorce court evokes both early brains. The lawyers, one could say, awaken the alarm system, and the anger of the couple awakens the feeding, sexuality, and ferocity system. Colin Turnbull, in his People of the Mountain, describes what happened to the formerly alert and generous IK tribe when the English took away their tribal lands and moved them to a new and barren territory. The feeding, sexuality, and ferocity system, uniting with the survival brain, overwhelmed all their codes of unselfishness, even their altruism toward children. The IKS grabbed food away from their own children, left grandparents to starve after stealing their food, dropped their dung on the doorsteps of neighbors, and so on. Turnbull was shocked to see how frail the civilized tendencies are. Like Margaret Mead, he saw how easily intricately learned behaviors, essential to a human life, could be lost. Now, we know that either the alarm system or the feeding, sexuality, and ferocity system can easily overwhelm a child. What equipment does the child have to resist? When an infant's hunger instinct is frustrated, we can see the infant call into play the ferocity system without a moment's hesitation. If the infant could accomplish what it wants at these moments, the mother and father would be burned to cinders. Shit would be heaped on their bodies, the chair would evaporate, and much ferocity would still be available. The feeding, sexuality, and ferocity system can overtake the adult as well. The Taine has several descriptions of what happened to the Celtic warrior Cuchulainn when he went into his warrior mode. One summation reads, "His calves and feet turn in reverse position. One eye bulges out, and one recedes into his skull. His hair becomes a tangle, and a jet of blood erupts straight up from his head, and causes the atmosphere to fill with a red mist. In this condition, he's difficult to defeat, but the same energy or rage that rises to defend the borders against his enemies can blindly turn against his own home and people." In late mammal times, the body evidently added a third brain. The development of the third brain, known as the neocortex or new mammalian brain, may be connected to the invention of tools, or it may be a response to changed climate conditions or descent from trees. It takes the form of an outer eighth inch of brain tissue laid over the surface of the old mammal brain. Its brain tissue is immensely elaborate and has millions of neurons per square inch. Observers speculate that it is capable through its circuitry of solving problems of immense complication. Some neurologists speculate that an intelligent person uses 1/100th of its power. Einstein may have used 1/50th of its power. If the reptile brain is associated with cold and the mammal brain with warmth, the third brain is associated with light. The parables of Christ and the advices of Buddha may involve instruction on how to transfer energy from the reptile brain to the mammal brain. and from the mammal brain to the new brain. The gold light around Buddha's head or a medieval saint's head may be an attempt to suggest the enormous light-giving power of the new brain. When we enter the therapist's office, we enter with a crocodile and a rhinoceros. We prefer not to look behind us. Knowledge of these two old brains helps us to understand the sort of plane on which the giant lives at the top of the beanstalk. We notice how fearful he is of any intrusion and how enormous his appetite is. By degrees, Jack recovered himself sufficiently to look at the giant through a crevice. He was astonished to see how much he devoured, and thought he never would have done eating and drinking. The source of our greediness and ferocity is known in other traditions as the Nafs. In the Muslim and Sufi tradition, the word Nafs simply means soul. There are 4 levels of the Nafs. The lower Nafs, which is the bitter soul, then the blaming Nafs, which blames itself and others, then the inspired Nafs, which begins to hear, and finally the Nafs at rest. One hears the Nafs at rest in much classical Persian music. The lower Nafs, the greedy one, is called the al-Nafs al-Amara, or the bitter soul. The term Nafs, as understood today, refers primarily to the greedy soul. Another phrase used for it is the commanding soul, which implies that it is dictatorial and tyrannical. Dr. Javad Nurbakhsh of Iran, the head of the Ni'matuli order of Sufis, says that the Nafs basically command its owner to do wrong. The commanding Nafs is that which has not passed through the crucible of aesthetic discipline or shed the tough hide of existence. It actively resists all of God's creation. This Nafs is of a bestial character that harasses other created beings and consistently sings its own praises. It always follows its own desires and grazes on the field of material nature. It drinks from the spring of the passions and knows only how to sleep, eat, and gratify itself. We can see how closely some of this description corresponds to ideas that Western scientists have worked out around the reptile brain and the old mammal brain. To say of the Nafs that it drinks from the spring of the passions is precisely the way one would speak of the mammal brain. It always follows its own desires, is right for the feeding, sexuality, and ferocity system. It knows only how to sleep, eat, and gratify itself. The reference to its bestial character refers to the Sufi belief that what we have inherited from the centuries in which we were animals are the claws and the teeth. But the Sufi visualization adds several new and valuable elements. It constantly sings its own praises. The Nafs wants to be praised and respected as something more civilized than it really is. Movies and television series that come straight out of the Nafs, such as Forrest Gump and Twin Peaks, present themselves as worthy of awards, and their writers insist their work is somehow an addition to high art. The Sufis say that the Nafs is utterly opposed to the spiritual intellect. Its main task is to move people toward selfishness and greed. Moreover, the Nafs itself claims to be God. Claiming that it is God, the Nafs expresses no fear of God. If we assume that the Nafs is acting among us in the West, the assumption throws some light on the Western insistence that one can snap one's fingers at God, an attitude so astonishingly distinct from the attitudes of earlier generations. The Nafs may, for example, command one to be a worshipper and ascetic, a servant, or a Sufi, solely for the purpose of being accepted by people, of being respected and praised by others. A certain Sufi master was devout in his behavior at prayers each day for years, always praying in the first row. One day, however, he arrived at the mosque late and had to pray from the back. He noticed that his Nafs was irritated, and soon the irritation penetrated his whole body. He realized it was the Nafs who loved to pray in front, so it could feel the praise. After that, he prayed in secret. One of the latent vices and secret maladies of the Nafs is its love of praise. Whoever imbibes a draught of it will move the 7 heavens and the 7 sublime realms for the very flutter of an eyelash. The symptom of this affliction is that when the Nafs is deprived of praise, it falls into violence and laxity. Dr. Nurbakhsh lists several other qualities of the Nafs. It is ignorant. It is quickly weary of all things. It is alive to the passions. It is arrogant and egocentric. It considers important the least thing it has done for anyone, remembering it for years afterwards, being overwhelmed by its own kindness, yet however great the favors others do for it. It places no importance on them, forgetting them quickly. The brilliance of this visualization is that it adds to the scientific visualization a kind of personality. The very constitution of the Nafs is founded on breach of etiquette. There's something funny about imagining a force whose very essence lies in breaking etiquette. The idea, however, makes us rethink the darker side of the American freedom of manners, which we were once so proud, but which is now shifting into gross rudeness between children and parents, between students and teachers, and even between people on the street or people on the internet. The Nafs is associated with the element of fire. It is like a firebrand both in its display of beauty and in its hidden potential for destruction. Though its color is attractive, it burns. Christianity puts some of its knowledge of the Nafs onto Satan, into whom we place the hatred of God. That attribution is valuable, and yet we could say it protects the energy far out in the universe, wherever Satan is. The Sufis maintain that the Nafs is inside everyone, available at every second, as near to us as our fingernails. Finally, the Sufis say that the Nafs in a person may lie for years as inactive as a snake or dragon frozen on a mountain. The Persian poet Rumi wrote a poem about this possibility. The giant in Jack and the Beanstalk resembles the Nafs in his huge appetite, in the way he seems to control completely the plane on which he lives, and most of all in his vast power suggested by the castle, the imprisoned human beings, the wealth, and his physical size. Jack's power is so small compared with the giant's that confrontation is out of the question. The boy finds a small place and hides there. The Sufis say that approximately 97% of human beings in any nation are controlled by the Nafs. Every breath they take comes out of the Nafs. All their acquiring and spending amounts to worship of the Nafs, and their reason or rational element, overwhelmed by the Nafs, is reduced to making up excuses for people's improper and embarrassing behavior. A few of the people in any nation, perhaps 2%, are, while possessed by the Nafs, also aware of it. Some of them try to appeal to the Nafs of the other 97%. These people, politicians, can get the masses to do what they want them to do. An example would be Reagan's suggestion to vote for me and we'll get the government off our backs. That the Nafs hate government would be a surprise to no one. Rumi wrote, "The animal soul has given birth to all the fetishes. A fetish made of wood is a little like a garter snake, but a fetish made of energy is closer to a dragon. To snap a wooden idol in two is extremely easy, but to break a dragon is a task beyond our power. My friend, if you're interested in the character of the insatiable soul, read an account of the 7 gates of hell. Cunning evasions flow out of the insatiable soul during every breath we take, and in that frail stream 100 pharaohs and all their armies could drown." Our effort here is to put clearly the odds that our I, or neocortex, faces when it tries to wrest governorship of the human organism away from the alarm system and the feeding, sexuality, and ferocity system well rooted in our archaic brains. It's like aware voters trying to wrest control of the country from the sleeping voters whom the Nafs inspires. The chance of that happening becomes smaller all the time. Those awake are what Hebrew culture has always called the remnant. There are perhaps 38 of them alive at any one time, none of them visible. They are probably people like Thomas Merton, sitting in a tiny cell somewhere writing about the connections between Buddhism and Christianity. Second interruption, where have all the parents gone? The loudest sound in Northern Europe at the end of the 19th century was the sound of the door closing when Nora, in Ibsen's A Dollhouse, left her husband to live alone. But now the loudest sound is of men leaving, several million in the United States. Nothing like this has been seen before. During the 1940s, the wartime draft pulled American men out of the house, but there was some feeling of sacrifice and nobility about that. And it was not voluntary. What can this voluntary leaving mean? Mothers are also leaving. Some English caretakers of elephants on the India subcontinent reported in July of 1995 that mother elephants in India were, for the first time, leaving baby elephants behind. So much forest cover has been destroyed that an elephant herd apparently feels anxiety in the long trek to the next forest cover, and mothers abandon baby elephants, who are then found wandering by themselves. During our 18th century, the American father was thought of as the stone and roof pillar of the family. The Puritan household in 1750 was set up so that it paralleled the Puritan state. Older men ran both. The service involved, for many fathers, more power than love, and it would be wrong to be sentimental or nostalgic about those families. We are talking not of the wisdom of father power, but merely of the extent of it. If we look at a family in, say, Salem, Massachusetts in 1750, the father was the navigator in social waters. He was the moral teacher and spiritual comforter. He was the earner who brought in the income and kept the family alive. He was the hearer of distress as well. Cares were brought to the mother and then to him. People imagined the family as a Hebraic unit, as if the children were all children of God and the house a tiny house of Abraham. But this arrangement soon faltered. When the West opened up, fathers and prospective fathers headed there. Many factories opened in New England. The father's eyes turned outward toward opportunity, factories, and long days, and the mother became the sole confidant of the children. Susan Juster and Mary Svinoskis say, the transition from the father to the mother as the primary socializer and educator of young children was completed by the 19th century. For a time during the mid-19th century, then, mothers became the sole center of the family. Many devotional meetings took place in the family. The heat of devotion entered the house, and the mothers taught inclusiveness, compassion, and self-restraint. We can feel the reality of such households in Mark Twain's novels. Mother was the navigator in social waters, the moral teacher and spiritual comforter, and the hearer of distress. In most families, the husband remained the earner. The mother's position changed again in the early 20th century. She lost power when the selling industry succeeded in inserting itself between her and the children. She could no longer provide the emotional tone of the house and pass on the tastes in books or music that her parents had given to her. For centuries in the West, the young had learned music through hearing, even learning, folk ballads, Bach, Mozart, opera, polka tunes, dance music that the previous generations had loved. The music industry soon saw that huge profits would flow from urging each generation to have its own music. Media heroes such as Elvis, Prince, Michael Jackson, and Madonna became, through the very number of eyes trained on them, people with that mana that comes from the attention of millions. The parents didn't stand a chance. These people were 1,000 times more exciting than one's parents. The siblings understand the new music, and soon that's all they hear. 6- and 7-year-olds are now listening to rap music that spouts active hatred of women. In fact, our children get most of their values from music, videos, and films, and even though we regret that situation, we have not yet found a way to change it. Mothers and fathers still do teach some values such as empathy, discipline, helpfulness, honesty, and community responsibility, but by and large, the parents are overwhelmed. Businesses' maneuver to substitute themselves for the parents has worked. Like the German Blitzkrieg, it took place so fast that no one could stop it. Most mothers remain in the house, but they have, like the fathers, the feeling that they are disposable. Parents in general have become less unconscious, and that's a great blessing. And yet the doubt and guilt that parents feel have flowed in from the truth-telling of the great psychologists. No one is to blame here. Yet we know that the fear of doing wrong as a parent while still remaining a child oneself has been contributing to the fleeing of the fathers. Many mothers would flee too if they thought they could. The English lawyer and writer Owen Barfield noticed a change in the English and American mind over the last 80 years. Some spot in the brain that used to hold the substance called responsibility now holds the substance called guilt. Are people feeling guilty nowadays? Well, if I were asked to lay my finger on one of the most striking differences between the social climate of Europe and the West as it is today, and as it was, say, 60 years ago, I think I should have to specify the presence in it almost everywhere of a vague, uneasy feeling of guilt. There's an atmosphere of guilt. Responsibility is food for the will. Guilt is food for the feelings only. Confused feelings of guilt tend to beget paralysis rather than energy. Those who are old enough to remember the years between the wars will recall the skillful use Hitler made of just that paralysis in the 30s, when even young people who were in their cradles at the time it was signed were somehow made to feel guilty about the unjust provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. He then refers to the cross-blaming that goes on at all levels of our society. Feelings of guilt tend to turn rather easily into feelings of hatred and contempt. We may feel a bit guilty ourselves, but we are very sure that a whole lot of other people are much more guilty, and probably ought to be destroyed. In the Sibling Society, we can see the deep bitterness between the right and left wings in the country, and the deep bitterness between men and women. Neither gender can stand the sense that it may be guilty of bad parenting, which it did without knowing any better. In her essay, But Where Are the Men?, Ruth Seidel correctly links the phenomenon of fathers leaving the house with economic realities. Layoffs that begin in the 1970s continue and sharply rise. The media concentrate on deadbeat dads, and that's understandable, and yet virtually no one blames an economic system that deprives millions of workers of jobs. American business made a decision some years ago to be competitive in the fast market, as opposed to keeping promises to workers or supporting their communities. From 1973 to 1991, the average hourly wage for production and non-supervisory workers steadily fell. From 1980 to 1993, the Fortune 500 companies shed more than 1/4, that is 4.4 million, of all the jobs that they had previously provided. Meanwhile, during that same period, these companies increased their assets by 2.3 times and their sales by 1.4 times. The major CEOs increased their annual compensation by 6.11 times. We know all these figures, and they're heartbreaking. To fathers and mothers, they are devastating. We know that the unskilled black man has little chance of obtaining a permanent job that would pay enough to support a family. He eventually becomes resigned to being unable to play the traditional father role, and rather than being faced with his own failure day after day, year after year, he often walks away. Unemployment among Native Americans, there are roughly 1 million, ranges between 45 and 55%, but it reaches 80% in some areas and in some seasons. Andrew Kimbrell remarks that the purportedly patriarchal industrial production system began by destroying fatherhood in England through the form of enclosures, which amounted to abolishment of common pastures ordered by the courts that drove men into the factories. The patriarchal system's destruction of fatherhood continues in the United States, and here it is free hours that are enclosed. In 1935, the average working man had 40 hours a week free, including Saturday and Sunday. By 1990, it was down to 17 hours. The 23 lost hours of free time a week since 1935 are the very hours in which the father could be a nurturing father and find some center in himself, and the very hours in which the mother could feel she actually has a husband. Many judges, sociologists, and lawmakers, moreover, have regarded fathers as insignificant in the family structure throughout the last 100 years. Decisions by judges to award custody to mothers both reflects the idea of the non-importance of fathers and deepens it. At the same time, we know that many 19th century fathers abandoned their families to go west, and many contemporary fathers abandon the family emotionally by working 14 hours a day. For whatever reasons, fathers are becoming scarce. Fathers are vanishing legally as well as physically. About 1/3 of all childbirths in the nation now occur out of marriage. In most of these cases, the place for the father's name on the birth certificate is simply left blank. Katha Pollitt, an otherwise bright columnist, said, "Why not have a child of one's own? Children are a joy. Many men are not." Misguided government decisions contributed to the exile of fathers from distressed families. AFDC money was granted to single mothers only if no man was living in the house. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his famous book of 1965, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, warned that this practice was causing devastation in the black community, but he was mocked and demonized by observers on both the right and the left, by both blacks and whites. His warning that the fatherlessness would spread to the white community was correct. Fatherlessness now stands at 60% and rising in the black neighborhoods, and 35% and rising in white neighborhoods. I think it is important to recognize that these mistakes in judgment do not amount to a conspiracy against men. It is simply that no one thought it out. The father seemed so pervasive, so constantly present, that no one grasped how swiftly that might change. Our vision of the family as an ecological system remains now at about the same level as our vision of the natural system in the 19th century, when no one really understood the way all elements in a long-growth forest, for example, depend on each other. If human beings remove one element, pine trees or squirrels, out of a deep-growth forest, much also changes. Seeding may depend on the squirrels. Some abusive fathers need to be taken out of the family, but there hasn't been much discrimination between kinds of fathers. The solution some sociologists have proposed to solve the problem of anger by removing fathers has had a serious effect on human culture as a whole, an effect we now see in the aggression of fatherless gangs among the disadvantaged, and the presence of depressed and passive youngsters among the advantaged. Chapter 3, Swimming Among the Half-Adults. In many ways, we are now living in a culture run by half-adults. Fraternities used to be the main exhibit of half-adults, with their half-realized pornography. In the computer Usenet news group, where digital images are stored, 83.5% of the pictures are pornographic. The half-adults, 20 to 30 years old, don't try to protect children from the files. Serious participation in politics is at an all-time low. Congress allows corporations to meet air quality standards by lowering the standards. We're always under commercial pressure to slide backward toward adolescence, toward childhood, with no effective rituals of initiation and no real way to know when our slow progress toward adulthood has reached its goal. Young men in our culture go around in circles. Those who should be adults find it difficult or impossible to offer help to those behind. And that pressure seems even more intense than it was in the 1960s, when the cry, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," was so popular. Observers describe many contemporaries as children with children of their own. People look younger all the time. Photographs of men and women 100 years ago, immigrants for example, show a certain set of the mouth and jaws that says, "We're adults. There's nothing we can do about it." By contrast, the face of Marilyn Monroe, of Kevin Costner, of the ordinary person we see on the street says, "I'm a child. There's nothing I can do about it." People watching Ken Burns' History of Baseball remarked that faces of fans even in the 1920s looked more mature than faces of fans now. Looking at those old photos, one sees men and women who knew how to have fun, but they had one foot in necessity. Walk down a European street these days and you will see that American faces stand out for their youthful and naive look. Some who are 50 look 30. And part of this phenomenon is good nutrition and exercise, but part of it is that we are losing our ability to mature. Adolescents are separating off as a group, and we know that the duration of childhood and adolescence has been lengthening over the past several decades. During the Middle Ages, the stage of youth was virtually ignored. A peasant child of 7 joined the workforce. At Plymouth Colony, a child was considered a small adult at the age of 8. Children were asked to be aware of the group. There was no real time for adolescence then. From the community's point of view, an adult is someone who knows how to preserve the larger group of which he or she is a part. Today's adolescent, by contrast, wants his or her needs gratified now, and seems not to notice that he or she is living in a complicated web of griefs, postponed pleasures, unwelcome labor, responsibilities, and unpaid debts to gods and human beings. Adolescents have generally refused to accept the larger goals of their elders. That attitude is proper to adolescence, which is a sort of larval stage. A problem develops, though, when people remain in adolescence long past its normal span. Animal adolescents, if we can use such a phrase, are always in training, and they soon become tuned to their group. Among apes and chimps, for example, young ones often feel responsible for the others, as we have learned from the famous story of the traveling baboons. That troop, guided by older baboons, and with a few younger ones going ahead as scouts, was moving through the jungle on a random trip to new ground. One young baboon came upon a tiger waiting quietly for the main troop to arrive. The young baboon threw himself on the tiger. He had no chance of winning that battle, and the ethologist who witnessed it realized that the baboon had sacrificed himself to save the troop members following behind. We know, too, that certain human communities, such as the Inuit and the Australian Aborigines, who live in harsh areas, produced, when their culture was intact, juveniles who knew how to preserve what had nurtured them. We all recognize that our emphasis on individualism in the West has dimmed whatever instincts Western youth might have had to preserve the troop. For some time now, our own spark of life has often been more compelling, more important to us than the flame of the larger group. American movies in the late 1950s vividly brought forward an old theme of adolescence, the impulse not to defend common projects, common stories, common values. James Dean and Marlon Brando played the roles of young men who demonstrated this rebellion, and the theme began to have an edge on it. "What are you rebelling against?" a Brando character is asked. "What do you have?" is the witty reply. But with that reply, the baboon troop is gone. Human beings often struggle to preserve a given cultural group through the stories it holds in common, its remembered history or fragments of it, and certain agreed-on values and courtesies. A gathering of novels, plays, poems, and songs, these days wrongly called the canon, more properly the common stories, held middle-aged people, elders, and the very young together. That most adolescents these days reject the common stories is no surprise. More often than not, they reject them without having read or heard them. When adolescence lasts only 3 or 4 years, the youth's refusal to support the commonly agreed-on novels and poems does not affect the long-range commitment of the group to this reservoir. But now, as American adolescence stretches from age 15 or so all the way to 35, those 20 years of sullen silence or active rejection of any commonality in literature or otherwise can have devastating results. One can say that colleges and universities are precisely where the gifts of the past are meant to be studied and absorbed, and yet those very places are where the current damage to the common reservoir is taking place. Men and women in their 20s take teaching jobs, and if they are still adolescent in their 30s, their hostility to the group's literature and to the group itself becomes palpable. We know it is essential to open the cabinet of common stories to include literature from other cultures besides the European, and to include much more women's literature than the old reservoir held. That is long overdue. But inclusion, one could say, is a job for adults. When the adolescent gets hold of it, a deep-lying impulse comes into play which says, "I'm taking care of people my age, and that's it. My needs are important, and if the group doesn't survive, it doesn't deserve to." English departments have always had Wordsworth killers and Lawrence killers, but a change has taken place. At modern language association conventions, papers whose language excludes everyone but the postmodernist sibling are now presented. One sees much sibling behavior, too, in corporate offices and computer vocations. We have our computers, and that's all we care for. Helping the group is for someone else. The rule for siblings of any age is, take care of your own, go along, and get along. Hostility toward the larger group can now be found even at the grade school level. A third grader says, I don't have to obey you. You're nothing but a teacher. A friend who drives a school bus has notified a significant change in children during the last few years. Grade school kids now, she says, have less respect for other people, less respect for others' property, and less respect for their own property. One sixth-grade girl whom I asked to close the bus windows at the end of the run last week closed one, and that done said, That's not my job. As parenting becomes less effective, children become more savage and uneasy and less able to feel a part of any dignified group. It is natural, then, that they look for respect and self-respect from their peers. People of all ages are making decisions to avoid the difficulties of maturity. Freud maintained in Civilization and Its Discontents that human beings feel a deep hate and a deep love for civilization. Civilized behavior demands repression and restraint, in the face of which, of course, the instinctual energies know they will not be satisfied. One way to outwit the demands that civilization makes is to set up a sibling society. To make all the necessary changes is hard, but once they're made, most of us can avoid the painful tasks of the civilized adult. When enough people have slid backward into a sibling state of mind, society can no longer demand difficult and subtle work from its people because the standards are no longer visible. Without the labor of artists, for example, to incorporate past achievements in brushwork, in treatment of light, in depth of emotion, in mythological intensity, people with some talent can pretend to be genuine artists. Their choices seem to be to cannibalize ancient art or to create absurdly ugly art that makes a statement. They don't ask themselves or each other for depth or intensity. And most contemporary critics pretend not to miss them. Another way of outwitting the demands of civilization is to make sex a plaything for regressed adults. Sex loses its grandeur and its fate. In past eras, some societies said, if you agree to accept the painful labors of parenting implicit in pair bonding, then you can have regular sexual release. Otherwise, no. We know of successful cultures that have allowed great sexual freedom, but the youngsters are not abandoned after the initial sexuality. They have the support of the entire tribe, which knows how to bring about adult behavior. The person who decides to omit the difficult labors of becoming civilized receives in return permission for narcissism, freedom from old discontents, and a ticket to the omni-theater, where fantasies are being run. One could say that the greedy and lazy part of the soul obtains permission to do as it wishes. Thousands of other siblings in other countries will cover for that person just as troops support each other in a retreat. Emily Dickinson said, I think the hemlock likes to stand upon a marge of snow. It suits his own austerity and satisfies an awe. The experience of austerity and the experience of maturity are connected. That men are in essence boys has long been a theme with women, but the boyishness used to be endearing. Now, it feels dangerous to those nearby. As the supply of adult men lessens, fewer daughters grow up experiencing the adult male presence, so they choose a mate without reference to any standard of maturity. Some women speak with surprise of a lover. He looked so good at first. He let his feelings show. He didn't have all these hard edges that the corporate clam men have. He talked about his childhood. He made me feel needed. Wasn't afraid to say he is scared. Then what? All of a sudden, he doesn't do his share. He leaves his clothes everywhere. He quits his job because there's too much hassle, and he doesn't try for another. If I tell him I'm feeling sad or lonely, his eyes look somewhere else in the room. Then I feel like a mother an unsuccessful mother at that, and as soon as that happens, he doesn't make love much anymore. We end up as brother and sister, that's it. It's over. Women are shocked to learn how many men are helpless, vulnerable, isolated, and depotentiated by longing. Women as well are directed by society to be young, even immature, physically and emotionally. There are women who can offer advice in adulthood, but they are seldom visible. Many young men no longer arrive at the Edipal wall. In the old paternal society, often unhealthy, particularly in the son-father rivalry, a son, around age 12 or 15, would hit the Edipal wall. It still happens. Perhaps the father assumes the right to tell the son what to do. Perhaps he arrogantly orders others around and does nothing himself. Or he belittles the son. You never do anything right. Why don't you get off your ass and do something? When the son in such a family gets angry and climbs the Edipal wall, he finds his father already there, at the top. The two wrestle. Sometimes one falls off, sometimes the other. Kafka's great story, The Judgment, describes a son who fell off. The son, living in an apartment alone with his aging father, loses the battle decisively. The father humiliates him, and the father suddenly seems so tall that he can touch the ceiling. As the story ends, the son rushes down the stairs and vaults over the bridge rail into the Vltava River, whispering, "Dear parents, I loved you all the same." If he lives through such a fight, the son acquires considerable confidence simply from having faced the father. Sometimes that earned confidence gives him the energy to become adult. Freud gave structure to this turmoil by using the Greek story of Oedipus, who, as William Stafford said, won so well he lost. Freud gave class, one could say, to the rough battle by naming it after a Greek hero. Psychologists after him have written extensively and well of the Oedipal wrestling. The amazing fact is that thousands of young American men in recent decades have never reached the Oedipal wall at all. If the father is physically absent, or even only emotionally absent, the wall is difficult to see or experience. A son may come near the wall and then curve gracefully back toward the mother. This curving back toward the mother's comfort is repeated so often in contemporary families that we must look at it. The German analyst Alexander Mitselish sensed that in North America the old love-hate relationship of son to father is fading. The typical American son's attitude, he said, includes a non-respect for the father, which is associated with very little affect indeed. Very little affect indeed describes unmistakably the emotional flatness we now see in young men. A young man studying to be a doctor remarked that he had very little feeling for his father. He didn't know him, and many of his friends were in the same boat. He complained that he couldn't find his anger, and he wondered if the absence of his father made his anger remain unconscious. He added, "And when I do feel anger, there's so much pressure from peers for it to be there that I don't know if it's valid or not. My girlfriend chose the day of my graduation from medical school to tell me she was leaving me. She said many hurtful things to me, but all I could think to do was to comfort her." His comforting was good, but something was missing from his response. Sons who have a remote or absent father clearly can receive no modeling on how to deal appropriately with male anger, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, how to honor it or let it go, or speak it without hurting someone. Such sons are usually so frightened of anger that they repress it entirely. Others, with no better modeling, become violent. Few sons in a city culture learn to fuse instinctive aggression with the pleasure of hard physical work. Few sons now share a toolbox with their father. The son experiences the father only in the world of longing. When the son used to meet the father on top of the Oedipal wall, their mutual anger sometimes had the sorry result of fistfights or even murder. But with many fathers absent, millions of males linger passively in a dangerous, frightening, and inarticulate fantasy world. And such a person is not free of aggression. He tends to radiate an aggression that is diffuse, non-directional, inconsolable. The names of some rock bands describe the situation very well. They call themselves Suicidal Tendencies, Pornophyros, Crash Test Dummies. Hole, Urge Overkill, and Arrested Development. Some of the late Kurt Cobain's lyrics certainly reveal inconsolable anxiety. The Beatles' affectionate lyrics are replaced by gangster rap. The artist Bruce Nauman's early images of woods and fields are replaced by dead horses and guns, and by video installations that pour out hostile words over and over to the museum goer. Nauman's 1984 neon sign says, "Play and die, know and die, smell and die, fall and die," and so on. Can we say that daughters no longer hit the electoral wall? Freud's attempt to set up the Electra complex, the love of the father and rejection of the mother, as a counterpart to the Oedipal story, was not completely convincing. The complementarity of the genders is not that cut and dried. Both genders need to learn to stand on their own, independent of their parents. The daughter has to disidentify, as psychologists say, from the mother's personality, and the son has to disidentify from the entire gender. Some succeed and some don't. But to disidentify is not at all the same thing as to repudiate. Daughters today often find themselves not with too much mothering, but with too little. Some interrupt their movement to adulthood by their felt need to ask others, other women, older men, lovers, for mothering. Some valiantly try to mother themselves, splitting into a small girl and a mother. Still others become pregnant at 14 deliberately, hoping to receive some sort of mothering from their child soon to come. Some element is missing among the reasons given for extended youth. We know that our culture extends adolescence, that the rarity of emotionally present fathers is a factor, that adulthood offers fewer economic incentives than it used to, that the emphasis on slenderness in youth holds back a majority of us, particularly females, in youthful states, that children find their help less essential to the community, and so on. But it is hard to get a job in India too, and yet that doesn't seem to bond Indians to adolescence. American fathers were absent in wartime without evidence of excessive failure of adulthood among their sons or fathers. Another element, I suspect the overuse or wrong use of the neocortex, is involved, and that would help explain why the infantilization is deepening in a culture increasingly driven by electronics. As a species, we are large-brained and large-skulled. We know that evolutionists envisage a long struggle between the movement toward a larger head and the limitations of the pelvis, whose bones limit the size of the head. The large head, as it is and has been, makes birth an intensely painful experience for the human female. "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children," God said to Eve. Part 2, Inside Families. Chapter 6, What do daughters stand to lose or gain in a sibling society? It's unlikely that a man or woman would be expected to say anything authoritative about the other gender. The stages through which a girl moves on her way toward womanhood and the possible effect the sibling society might exert on those stages is something for a woman to write, who knows many times more about these matters than I do. And yet the questions are so important that I'm unwilling to leave out this chapter. I will be guided in this piece by the work particularly of Jessica Benjamin and Jean Baker Miller. The concept they want psychologists to grasp is how deeply the development of women is interactive, how much it is based on participation and affiliation. Today we know much more about the baby's experiences in the womb. Books such as The Secret Life of the Unborn Child make everyone aware of what many mothers have always known, namely, that there is much consciousness inside the womb. After several months, the infant is aware of everything the mother says or does, hears a great range of noises, centering most of all on the mother's heartbeat, and responds with kicks or movements of arms and legs to emotions that the mother expresses. The baby's body responds to sadness, to anger, to stories, to music, to individual words. The baby already knows the sort of world she will be born into, and all the evidence suggests that this time in the womb is an ecstatic age for most souls. Surrounded and nourished like a queen, the fetus destined to be female moves calmly, step by step. Some researchers compare the female's womb experience to a dancer ascending a spiral staircase. Each step appears where it belongs. There are no sudden jumps or moves to the side. And after 9 months, the girl emerges radiant and full of energy. The time in the womb has been her first experience of growing by being together, and she will never forget that. The newborn girl baby usually finds herself during the first 18 months after birth in a love affair with her mother. It is a love between two conscious beings. The baby soon recognizes her mother's face and the emotions in it, and the two begin a dance together. The mother has a reservoir of voices that the baby can hear, and the baby changes her expression so as to elicit more of those sounds. Sometimes this ecstasy of likeness or participation floods both nervous systems. The baby soon learns to regulate her side of it, for when the intensity becomes too much, she will turn her face aside. She learns that she can do something. She is not helpless. She, too, has power. Some psychologists, the Freudians among them, made a serious verbal mistake in settling on the term object love for the fascination a human being has for its mother or other beings. Object love implies that the baby is a subject and that the mother or another person an inert object, like a mineral. But both are subjects. The joy they feel is in the mutual subjectivities, the mutual participations. Jean Baker Miller and her associates who work at the Stone Center for Development Studies at Wellesley argue that most accepted models for development of female babies are wrong. Some of those models were developed through the study of males. And the male principle is that growth occurs through a process of separation. A Western bias of individualism and a Lone Ranger ethic of meeting challenges underlies most psychological theories of the self. The new ideas say that females grow differently through cooperative behavior. Jean Baker Miller remarks, "I think that the infant begins to develop an internal representation of itself as a kind of being that, for the moment, I will call by a hyphenated term, a being in relationship. The baby discovers that she is part of the world around her. For example, if she is sad or happy, her mother's face may also grow sad or happy. It's important then for the parent to mirror the baby's emotions. The therapists around the English psychologist, John Bowlby, have developed a sentence about that idea, useful for both parents. A blank face is a biological crime." The girl baby then experiences exchanges, mingled feelings, participations in this early love affair with her mother. The father, although seen and delighted in, does not really, observers believe, at the start, affect this closeness. The baby girl often feels through her mother the enormous abundance and generosity of the world. The vital center in her solar plexus says yes to food, to affection, to excitement, to language, to closeness. This yes is the good breast. Of course, like everything else, the mother-daughter closeness has its dark side. The daughter also receives from the mother hunger, frustration, and abandonment. Melanie Klein named the experience of hunger, frustration, and abandonment the bad breast. In the child's magical thinking, the bad breast becomes the witch, who is cold, whose breasts are cold, who is isolated in some hut in the forest, dangerous, an eater, not a feeder. Such witch images are not patriarchal propaganda, but precise images of the child's experience of the bad breast. Young children love to hear fairy stories because certain images help a girl or boy understand that what they have experienced around the good and bad sides of their mother is real, and they are not crazy. The baby, too, has a dark or wild side. D.W. Winnicott and his students have put forward the idea that the infants of either gender want at some moments to utterly destroy the mother or whoever is caring for them. It is a healthy thing for a baby to get to know the full extent of her rage. If she really is determined, she can hold her breath and go blue in the face and then have a fit. For a few minutes, she really intends to destroy or at least to spoil everyone and everything, and she does not even mind if she destroys herself in the process. Naturally, you do what you can to get the child out of this state. It can be said, however, that if a baby cries in a state of rage and feels as if she has destroyed everyone and everything, and yet the people around her remain calm and unhurt, this experience greatly strengthens her ability to see what she feels to be true is not necessarily real. But fatherlessness increases the daughter's risk of becoming a teenage mother by a substantial amount. The risk of dropping out of high school also increases, and the chance of going to college decreases. Early pregnancy and motherhood is a disastrous setback to the young woman's need for open space and solitude. Finally, we need to look at the young woman's loss in emotional life if, for whatever reason, she has lived since birth in a house with no father. We know that the first love affair with the mother will still take place, but the second love relationship with the father from age 1.5 to 3 will not take place. With that goes a deep base of affection for the father, and by extension, for the masculine. Increasing difficulty between women and men in relationships and marriage may have some of its source in the increasing number of women who have not experienced an early, non-invasive love relationship with a father. The Sibling Society then, with its fatherlessness, its openness to junk culture, its encouragement of early and shallow sexuality, its destruction of courtesy, and its economic uncertainty, has had a severe impact on daughters' souls. We need to do grieving about these losses. Chapter 7. What do sons stand to lose or gain in a sibling society? Traditional stages. No matter how far back we go into the reaches of the past, sons have lived, except for particular periods of history dominated by devastating wars or natural catastrophes that have interrupted family life, in close proximity to their fathers and grandfathers. How close the relationship was is another matter. In African and Indonesian cultures, sons remain exclusively with mothers until they are 6 or 7. Then the men, living together in buildings at the edge of the village, return and take the sons away to initiatory huts for a period extending from 2 or 3 months to their entire life. And such fathers, once they do intervene, offer tremendous attention to the boys, and some of it helpful, some not. The aim of the initiation, some practices of which are stupid, some brilliant, some brutal, some mediocre and ineffectual, is imagined as a way to complete the development of the being from a neutral genderlessness to a state of genuine masculinity. It is meant to complete a process that was begun but not finished in the womb. Research in recent years has found out many details about the production of a male or female baby from a neutral form. We know that if the fetus is marked to become male at about the 6th week of pregnancy, the fetus goes through something like 250 changes, which alter upper torso muscle, change some bone length, provide a throwing ability in the arms, change the clitoris into a penis, change the vulval tissue into the scrotal sac, and so on. Several books describe this process in detail, among them Brain Sex by Anne Moir and David Jessel. The route from the womb to this unknown, barely imagined place called masculinity is a long one and can be interrupted at hundreds of points. It's almost as if men were an experimental species. The smallest Aborigine group living in the desert or the most tightly knit Eskimo family living in the Arctic has the same problems with confused young males as we do. Most observers consider our time in the womb a significant part of our life, even of our conscious life. We know that babies hear a great deal while in the womb and respond by differing movements to the mother's voice and the father's voice, seemingly dance a little to certain kinds of music, and some people say that babies' bodies respond to different parts of speech, distinguishing among a noun, a verb, and a preposition. The general belief is that for most babies, the time in the womb is so satisfactory that it borders on the heavenly. All is provided when it is needed. There's no gravity. If the mother lives in a calm house, the baby feels calm. In a safe house, the baby feels safe. The oceanic feeling is the famous phrase through which one can compare one's time in the womb to a later sense of being held in the safe hands of God. In other words, with the so-called religious emotions of adulthood and various kinds of blessings. Freud claimed he never felt the resemblance, but he listened carefully to men and women who did. The first stage of a boy's life, then, as of a girl's, is this womb bliss, which the baby leaves apparently with some reluctance. At about age 1.5, so researchers declare, the son begins to switch his intense gaze over to the father. Mothers have to be prepared for this. The rowdy play of the father suddenly seems much more attractive. Probably before 1.5, the infant boy sees the father as simply an alternative mother. But now, he feels strangely drawn to this different energy and different body mood. The father throws him up in the air or rolls around and imitates a bear. The son knows that the vibrations of the molecules here are different. And the boy sometimes gets high on this new vibration too. A love affair with the father now starts. It will be one of the most crucial events in his whole life, but he will not be able to speak of it because it takes place mostly before speech. It is a non-competitive, ecstatic relationship with an idealized father. Peter Bloss, who has done his work on the fruitful Freudian model, remarks that most Freudian analysts prefer to omit this love affair and talk about the competitive, angry, conflict-ridden relationship with the father later in adolescence. The adolescent boy can always describe that one, with fire and vivid metaphors, but the earlier one is lost. Bloss noticed that when he was in long therapy with an adolescent boy, the adolescent would speak of his current, angry, disparaging, contentious, cold relationship with his father. And when all that had been talked out and said, the boy would be as if looking farther back, and then in silence would sob for a long time. Because that earlier love happened before words, he has no words to describe it. And the contrast between his joy then and his loneliness now is so deep that he can only weep. The non-competitive love also served other purposes, Bloss remarks. The attachment to the father served the little boy, as it does for all little boys, as an anchor, which steadied him from the drifting into the powerful currents of his need for the pre-Edipal mother. The re-engulfing mother is another way to refer to the fear sensation that both boy infants and girl infants experience around the nourishing mother, a fear that their frail independence will be swept away in the tide pullback to the large and delicious mother. For the boy, the love affair with the father produces amazing delight if the boy can perceive that he is made of the same stuff as his father. If the mother says, "You and your father are both drinking from a blue cup. You are as alike as two peas in the pod," the boy, as Jessica Benjamin mentions, may cry out, "Mommy, say that again." This sort of love has been named identificatory love. The son, when 20 or so, may not be able to speak about his early father love, ecstatic in its sweetness, but the memory remains held somewhere in his body as a source of grace that can lead to a profound gentleness later in his life, can also be re-experienced in a gathering of men. The media have made fun of men's events in the woods or out, but a gathering of men, particularly when it lasts a week, when the range of ages includes older men, and when some grief is encouraged, has a mysterious power for change in the man attending. A man who in daily life is given over to competitive business may be living in the mood he experienced when he was 15, competing with his father. When he feels around him dozens of men who are grieving or smiling, he may remember far down in his cells that earlier love for the father. He often goes home and calls up his father, and a change begins, very helpful for his marriage and his parenting. It is a thought that when a boy is about 3 years old, identificatory love for his father begins to fade. He has felt two relatively untroubled loves, first with his mother, sweet and right, and next with his father, exciting and right. And now the twosomes vanish, and the number 3 comes in, a chaotic and anguished threesome. The boy still loves the mother and feels that she belongs to him, but it becomes clear that this large man whom he adores has some claim on the woman he loves, and her behavior changes when the big one is around. The changes feel life-threatening. Moreover, powerful sexual energies earlier arrived have deepened. His mother is someone who not only feeds him, but is young and attractive. Europeans at the turn of the century found this assertion that sex is present in 3-year-olds the one they hated Freud most for. Freud would give his weekly lecture, required by his university post, every Wednesday night, but no one would come. He'd deliver his lecture to a single person, a male friend, every Wednesday night. After that, he played cards every Wednesday night with this other man for the rest of his life. If sexual energy is present at 3, the 3-year-old boy feels sexual rivalry, a kind of mammal possessiveness and mammal jealousy, complete with fantasies of murder. Turmoil lives in the house. No one is safe. Freud recognized that the boy is a little Oedipus. He's a self-obsessed little Greek king who wants to sleep with his mother and knock his father out of the wagon in any order. His nervous system is not yet big enough to accommodate these immense flows of feeling. Later, when he is 12 or so, he will encounter the same conflicting emotions again. Ideally, by that time, he will be more skilled in dissembling, the more capable of enduring contradictory sets of emotions. But for now, it is agony. Losses for sons in the Sibling Society. Like daughters, sons stand to suffer considerable losses in the Sibling Society. We'll mention here 5 such areas. The consequences of fatherlessness could be called the first loss. The loss begins early. For a son with no father at all, it's obvious that no matter how generously his mother raises him, the initial affair with the father between ages 1.5 and 3 cannot take place. One could say a son loves masculinity first by loving it in his own father. Having no father means that 1/2 of his love energy is not activated or developed, and he will never be sure if he likes masculinity or not. With no father in the house, he may love his mother more for a while. He will appear to have won possession of his mother, which is for him not a good outcome. It's doubtful that an adolescent son without a father could complete his Oedipal task, which amounts to wrestling with the father and testing himself against this imposing being. He needs to renounce dependence on his mother as well. The fatherless son may repudiate his mother instead, or merge with her and then put off the wrestling with an older man until later in his life, meanwhile hating male authority without much knowledge of it. 85% of male convicts are fatherless. If a son has appointed himself as his mother's guardian, he may also end up worrying about his abandoned mother all the time, rather than living his own life. The son in the Sibling Society will also find that his latency period is drastically shortened. We'll call that the second loss. Sexuality originating in the adult sphere and arriving in the form of X-rated films, suggestive advertising, and pornographic videos and magazines penetrates more deeply each year into the child's world. It stirs up sexuality before the psyche has been properly prepared. When that happens, the boy becomes a premature adolescent and perhaps later a perpetual adolescent. The ego has not been given time for its brooding and dreaming, nor for its curiosity about the positive, mysterious sides of adult life. Junk culture's shortening of latency damages both the sons and the daughters. Thirdly, economic relationships in the Sibling Society tend to be cutthroat. Competitiveness in the corporate world is so intense now that it has been described as toxic. The result is that genuine mentoring, essential to young men, is disappearing. A young man learns not to trust older men. He's stuck with people in his own age group, many of whom, like him, have neither father nor mentor. The computer culture, an ineradicable element of sibling life, is producing isolation, and we'll call that the fourth loss. The punished son, exiled to his own room, is now replaced by the internet son. Computers, as we know, lead to a further drying up of conversation with adults, and the son becomes locked away from his own feelings. The ritual teacher Martin Prechtel believes that the computer use is damaging young people more deeply than we understand. Young men have often expressed their distance by putting on a hard exterior shell, a kind of mechanical skin, but many young men now, modeling themselves unconsciously on computers, tend to be machine-like on the inside. They experience input and output. There's a loss of expressiveness and affiliation. Finally, the Sibling Society offers very little generosity or support to young men. We'll call that the fifth loss. The words, opinions, and tastes of siblings have a lot of acid in them. That music is shit, man. More broadly, the ridicule of masculinity that is poured out of comic strips, from Dagwood Bumstead to Homer Simpson, from sitcoms and Letterman monologues, and from university classrooms, has had a profoundly damaging effect on young men. Gender feminists have contributed to this problem, encouraging stereotypes of masculinity that would be totally unacceptable if directed toward any other group. The French writer Elisabeth Badinter remarks, "The new equation, male equals bad, has given rise to a loss of identity for a whole generation of men." The consolidation or fading of fires, characteristic of post-adolescence, is worsening for young men, many of whom fall into chronic despair because of economic hopelessness and a sense that the society has thrown them away. Because of bad schools and spiritual poverty, the agency of aspiration fails to develop in millions of boys. Because of parental neglect, the agency of prohibition is twisted. How can young men or women in the inner city create a lofty companion? They don't see preachers or scientists, they see drug dealers or crackheads. Schools are too disintegrated or distracted to give them news of depth or nobleness, and we know what the newspapers and televisions deliver. The unprecedented failure of fathering in our time will have effects to the 6th and 7th generations, and many single mothers have had no choice in their family, whether it is fathered or unfathered. But other women choose, foolishly I think, to have children and skip over the father part. If raising a child alone in a paternal society was precarious, even with many extended families existing, raising a son alone is doubly precarious in the Sibling Society. Our society does not offer reliable mentors to help a son establish a link to the adult masculine. The Sibling Society is without vital religious institutions, so a son cannot easily find a second father in religious work or in the spiritual world. Capitalism has siphoned off male energy so as to allow deeper exploitation of children. If we knew what children are suffering inside, we would beg every man we meet on the street to give up his career and become a father. Chapter 14. What is vertical thought? That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations, at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. Yeats presents these complaints as if he had thought of them only when he was old. Yeats was 62 in 1927 when he wrote about the abundant sexuality of young men and young women, the young in one another's arms, the abundance of the fish tribes, the mackerel-crowded seas, and the obsession in Irish society with whatever is begotten, born, and dies. He was growing old himself, but actually the contrast between sexuality and the ageless had been a prime element of his thought since he was very young. Yeats' longing is not that all sensual music would disappear, for he loved sexual energy and wrote of it magnificently. He worries instead about what is forgotten in the headlong pursuit of sexuality. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. We know from his essays that the word intellect here does not mean practical intellect, that is, the reasoning power of the scientist or engineer. It means the spiritual intellect, out of which Muhammad wrote the Quran, Hildegard of Bingen wrote her poems, St. Augustine wrote his Confessions, that spiritual intellect that Plato and Plotinus loved so much. What the spiritual intellect creates does not die. Poems created by the spiritual intelligence, such as Dante's Divine Comedy, are as alive now as they were in the year they were written. Ibn Arabi, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Emily Dickinson, Margaret of Navarre, all welcomed the spiritual intelligence. When Yeats was 73, a few months before his death, he heard a voice that said, "Lie down and die." he replied, "That were to shirk the spiritual intellect's great work, and shirk it in vain. There is no release in a bodkin or disease, nor can there be a work so great as that which cleans man's dirty slate. While man can still his body keep, wine or love drug him to sleep. Waking, he thanks the Lord that he has body and its stupidity, but body gone, he sleeps no more, and till his intellect grows sure that all's arranged in one clear view, pursues the thoughts that I pursue, then stands in judgment on his soul, and all work done, dismisses all out of intellect and sight, and sinks at last into the night." Yeats is not making a great contrast between sexuality and the spiritual intellect as between day and night. He talks of what is easily forgotten in Western culture. Spiritual intelligence needs to be the base on which sensuality and all else rests, but fish, flesh, or fowl. Commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. In the summer, we could say no one cares about the afterlife. The Romanian writer Clorin remarked wittily, "Now that no one believes in the afterlife, everyone writes." Many human activities, writing among them, can be thought of as an attempt to create an immortality without the help of the immortals. Most Egyptians, as far as we know, by contrast, lived in simple wooden huts, but built enormous, permanent mansions for the gods. We build such mansions for brokers. Buddhists have a term for the obsession with copulating, having children, raising children, passing property on to them, getting sick and dying. And they call it being on the meat wheel. The meat wheel goes around century after century. Millions are born and die. Then a spirit, perhaps Buddha, comes along who wants to get off the meat wheel. This is felt by ordinary people as a revolutionary idea, and it inspires hundreds of years of intense vertical devotion in Asia. 1,000 monks of Ceylon or Tibet live in a single monastery, all anxious to leave the meat wheel. The Sibling Society is almost the pure antithesis of a Tibetan monastery. We have drunk beer so long that we have virtually forgotten the taste of real wine. Rumi and Hafez refer over and over to wine, which carries the flavor for the longing for God, the taste of the vertical, which is the after flavor of ecstasy. How blessed is the man who, like Hafez, has tasted his heart the wine made before Adam. To become a genuine artist in our society is more and more difficult because fewer and fewer people have tasted in their heart the wine made before Adam. Even if an artist creates a spiritual work, the readers are so flat, the art critics are so horizontal, that its wine is not recognized. The Native American view that whenever one makes a decision, one should think of its effect down to the 7th generation is a vertical thought. The opposite of that would be a decision based on short-term profits, which often means refusing to invest in the plant or in the people who work in the plant. In vertical thought, there is no distinction between men and women. One becomes an elder when one learns to think vertically. Another instance of vertical thought is the idea that a spiritual twin was born with you. At birth, the two of you separated, and perhaps you might not see your spiritual twin again in this life, although you would always long for her or him. In such a culture, the candles at the birthday party are lit for the twin, not for you. There's a hint of that in Russian birthday celebrations, in which a person shares a name day with a saint, so one's birth date is also a celebration for that saint. In American birthday parties, the little boy or girl thinks the cake and the candle are for them. There's no hint of any other being to whom one might be grateful. Vertical poetry and art like to imagine the patterns of water flowing under the earth, dragons exploding out of earth waters and rising into the clouds. Vertical thought likes to imagine the vast distances between the stars. Giacomo Leopardi, as he sat alone on an Italian hillside at dusk, said, "This hermit's hill has always been dear to me, also this hedgerow which keeps me hidden, partially from the gaze of the wide horizon, sitting here and looking, I fashion with my mind the spaces beyond the earth that have no end, in those silences that are not human at all, in the deepest of all quiet for a little while. My heart feels no fear. Then, as I hear wind freshen through the leaves, I go farther and compare this sound to that everlasting silence. And I remember eternity and all the long dead seasons, in this present season, alive with her voices, and so my thoughts find themselves in that immensity, shipwrecked, and sweet to me is the drowning in that sea. Drowning and descent are not so much feared by the vertical gazers. Antonio Machado said, "Mankind owns 4 things that are no good at sea: rudder, anchor, oars, and the fear of going down." Hedevich of Antwerp says, "I do not complain of suffering for love. It is right that I should always obey her, for I know her only as she is in herself. Whether she commands in storm or in stillness, this is a marvel beyond my understanding, which fills my whole heart and makes me stray in a wild desert." The higher the spirit goes, the more deeply the soul sinks down into the waters of melancholy and tragedy, and going down into those waters is a sweet thing. Rumi says, "The captain walks on the planks of fearful things that might happen. He walks on the decking of marvelous things that might happen. When both decking and planks are gone, nothing remains but the drowning." Vertical attention implies the ability, or at least the longing, to look downward, or the ability to look upward at the stars, at the energies beyond the stars, at angels. One problem with the Sibling Society is that in its intense desire to get away from hierarchy, it unintentionally avoids all vertical longing. We could say that vertical longing has to do with feeling and hierarchy with power. The Catholic Church took over or adapted the power hierarchies of the Roman Empire, and that has conflated the two, longing and hierarchy, ever since. It has confused everything. Epilogue. I began this book in a rather light-hearted tone. I enjoyed at the start the delicious contradictions we see all around us. At a convention for 16-year-olds who had gone through drug recovery, a t-shirt read, "Do you feel like we do?" I remembered a pre-sibling t-shirt. "Do you think like me? If so, I'm changing my mind." Everyone seems to feel that it's good to call strangers by their first name. When we call to get our checking account balance, we hear a chilling series of impersonal orders such as, "Press 1. Now press 6. Press the pound key. Press in the Social Security number." Then an intimate voice says, "Robert, what can I do for you?" I say, "Mr. Bly" to you. The first names make sense in a sibling way. The speaker doesn't want to imply by using your last name that your family is different from hers or his. To omit the last name is to say, your ancestors are totally unimportant to us. You are a highly individualized individual floating in a bright ocean of individuals, and we just love your particular essence. We are so deeply on a first-name basis that a total stranger can call you into a consultation room and tell you on a first-name basis that you are about to die. But as I began to realize the extent and implications of the Sibling Society, my lightheartedness went away, and some weight, as of economics, settled in. The fading of the father as provider in American culture seemed a significant event to me, and I had assumed that anger against the patriarchal family, some of it justified, was the primary cause. But work on this book has convinced me that other forces have taken part. Those devoted to the bottom line have effectively interposed themselves between the father and the family. Part of the effort has been to get at the children more easily. The more the parents' dignity and strength are damaged, the more open children are to persuasion. All of us who have been angry at the fathers rejoiced at first when the fathers lost authority, but the picture becomes more somber when we realize that the forces that destroyed the father will not be satisfied and are moving toward the mother. Mothers are discounted everywhere. When mothers and fathers are both dismembered, we will have a society of orphans, or more exactly, a culture of adolescent orphans. I was surprised as I began writing the book that a culture run by adolescents, or by adults in an adolescent mood, would treat children so badly. But in fact, adolescents living in an actual family do not pay much attention to the ones above them, nor the little ones beneath them. And that is particularly true if the adolescents feel like orphans. I would say that an adult is a person not governed by what we have called pre-Edipal wishes. The demands for immediate pleasure, comfort, and excitement. Moreover, an adult is able to organize the random emotions and events of his or her life into a memory, a rough meaning, a story. It is an adult perception to understand that the world belongs primarily to the dead, and we only rent it from them for a little while. They created it. They wrote its literature and its songs, and they are deeply invested in how children are treated, because the children are the ones who will keep it going. The idea that each of us has the right to change everything is a deep insult to them. The true adult is the one who has been able to preserve his or her intensities, including those intensities proper to his or her generation and creativity, so that he or she has something with which to meet the intensities of the adolescent. We could say that an adult becomes an elder when he or she not only preserves those intensities, but adds more. An adult is a person who, in the words of Ansari, goes out into the world and gathers jewels of feeling for others. Finally, the adult quality that has been hardest for me as a greedy person to understand is renunciation. The older I get, the more beautiful the word renunciation seems to me. We need to recreate the adult and to honor the elder. The hope lies in our longing to be adults and the longing for the young ones, if they know what an honorable adulthood is, to become adults as well. It's as if all this has to be newly invented, and the adults then have to imagine as well what an elder is, what the elder's responsibilities are, what it takes for an adult to become a genuine elder. In this problem, the example of the Native American community will be of great help. Here's one final story, a Norwegian story. A man walking through the forest and in danger of dying from cold sees at last a house with smoke rising from the chimney. He sees a 30-year-old man chopping wood and says to him, "Pardon me, but I'm a traveler who has been walking all day. Would it be possible for me to stay overnight in your house?" The man says, "It's all right with me, but I'm not the father of the house. You'll have to ask my father." He sees a 70-year-old man standing just inside the door and says, "Pardon me, but I'm a traveler and have been walking all day. Would it be possible to stay overnight in your house?" The old man says, "It's all right with me, but I'm not the father of this house. You'll have to ask my father, who is sitting at the table." He says to this man, who looks about 100 years old, "Pardon me, but I'm a traveler who's been walking all day. Would it be possible for me to stay overnight in your house?" The 100-year-old says, "It's all right with me, but I'm not the father of this house. You'll have to ask my father." And he gestures toward the fireplace. He sees a very old man sitting in a chair near the fire. He walks over to him and says, "I'm a traveler. I've been walking all day. Would it be possible for me to stay overnight in your house?" In a hoarse voice, this old man says, "It's all right with me, but I am not the father of the house. You'll have to ask my father." The traveler glances at the boxed-in bed, and he sees a very, very old man who seems no more than 4 feet tall lying in the bed. He raises his voice and says to him, "Pardon me, I'm a traveler, and I've been walking all day. Would it be possible for me to stay overnight in your house?" The little man in the bed says in a weak voice, "It's all right with me, but I'm not the father of this house. You'll have to ask my father." Suddenly the traveler sees a cradle standing at the foot of the bed. In it lies a very, very little man, hardly the size of a baby, lying curled in the cradle. The traveler says, "Pardon me, I'm a traveler. I've been walking all day. Would it be possible for me to stay at your house tonight?" In a voice so faint it can hardly be heard, the man in the cradle says, "It's all right with me, but I'm not the father of this house. You'll have to ask my father." As the traveler lifts his eyes, he sees an old hunting horn hanging on the wall, made from a sheep's horn, curved like the new moon. He stands and walks over to it. There he sees a tiny old man, no more than 6 inches long, with his head on a tiny pillow and a tiny wisp of white hair. The traveler says, "Pardon me, I'm a traveler, and I've been walking all day. Would it be possible for me to stay overnight in your house?" He puts his ear down close to the hunting horn, and the oldest old man says, "Yes." We know there is a seventh mother of the house, who is also very small. Perhaps she's far inside the womb or sitting in the innermost cell of our body, and she gives us permission to live, to be born, to have joy. Her contribution is life. The contribution of the seventh father is a house. Together, they grant permission from the universe for civilization.